Soundproof. Jordan will update you, we're changing venues tomorrow.
Sounds good.
So if you could let, I think Jordan's going to send an email.
Yeah, I'll send it out with the address and stuff, time and stuff.
That's right, and to other submitters, but if you're in contact with any
Yes, that'd be great. Yeah.
Who was that?
Alvita, she was the Cross Bird manager.
Oh.
I'll forward it on to you guys. I only just got it.
So will there be anyone here? Okay. Thank you. I think we're still with Mr. Cochrane, and we will resume with sort of some follow-up questions on your evidence. Now, we do have questions around the environmental management and monitoring plan. Are we best to start with yourself on that? Because I think it was an attachment to your evidence, wasn't it? So
yeah. So some of those questions I might need to forward to Ms. Maxwell to address.
Yeah. Okay. We've got most of the questions in terms of science around it. Yeah. And I'll just maybe we'll just chip in terms of clarification, because it's useful just to get it in plain language.
Okay, so I'm just going through. So like I said before, I wrote my questions based on what report I'm reading. So I've actually I've got some questions around the implications of the modelling report, and then I'll go to your evidence and then the supplementary evidence and the environment. So I'll try and keep things as brief as possible. But the first question I have actually is about the mixing zone. As you recall, we had some questions about that last time. And I'm actually still unclear about where the mixing zone is. Because modelling used the confluence of the discharge drain and the Matarangi stream as a discharge point, whereas I understand the point of compliance for the discharge is the UV treatment plant, the end of the UV treatment. Is that correct? Compliance limits for the discharge is from discharge from the wastewater treatment, So obviously there are some things that apply to the mixing zone and the boundary, being beyond reasonable mixing. So we do need to have a mixing zone defined, and also are there monitoring sites within and beyond it? There will be places here where you can say this is beyond the mixing zone. Just get some clarity around that.
So I guess this panel,
area. Yeah, it'd be close. Great. Look, there's a part of that question that I'm not fully confident to answer, but and that's around where in the wastewater treatment plant process the discharge occurs. So I think that's after all effective treatment is taken, which is downstream of UV.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I thought it was kind of. I think we asked this question at the previous hearing, and I think Ms. Prokop, you actually answered that in terms of it was at the end of the treatment, so it is actually the end of that pipe.
After the
Yeah. So I'm talking about the receiving environment. Thank you.
So from there, the wastewater, as I understand it, goes through the diffusion beds, and then into the discharge drain, and then from there travels basically towards the east and south on the discharge drain, and discharge to the Matarangi stream at the discharge point. So that's my understanding from a planning point of view, is where the effects of the discharge is evaluated at the discharge point where it enters the Matarangi.
So it is at the confluence,
It's the
okay.
confluence of the discharge drain of the Matarangi stream.
Okay,
So it's immediately upstream of Lower Matarangi A in the figure 1.
okay. That's very helpful, thank you. Okay. Can you explain the rationale for the 50 cubic metres per day as a trigger? And then I think it was it 20% from 2032, is that what proposed?
Yeah, and look, apologies for confusion because I think that sits in the EMP.
Yes.
So, look, the background to that was that we needed to settle on something in terms of ongoing, something that would trigger some ongoing monitoring over the term of the consent post that commissioning.
Yep.
Post treatment plant commissioning period. I took 50 cubic metres or 20% increase over the post commissioning annual discharge rate is a reasonable number. So if you look at 50 cubic metres per day on average, should be the one that you'd be thinking about when you're making your decision. So please disregard the 20%. As a sort of a reasonable step to take. And while Mr. Shandy was talking about the uptake over the duration, or the uptake of lots over the duration of the consent, where this morning he talked about 1471 that's connected, 319 that's are allocated but not connected, 180 to come. The balance of stuff that's yet to be connected and still to come represents 250 cubic metres of discharge on average per day that is not being, if this consent was approved, it's not being enacted, and the consent's not being exercised yet. So if we're looking at 50 years post that period of commissioning monitoring of around about 27 years, that would mean that we would go back and reassess or redo our environmental effects monitoring sort of just over every 5 years. And I think in terms of the consent conditions, we said every 50 cubic metres per day increase for 5 years, whichever is more frequent. So that gives us a number of touch points over the duration of the balance of the consent where we go out under the EMP and we re-monitor a range of parameters that are set out under the EMP. The rationale for that seems it's got a frequency and increase in load as the other.
So it doesn't have any ecological relevance?
Not particularly, no. It's largely like practical.
And it doesn't have any relevance to the functioning of the operation of the plant?
Not in terms of my understanding of the operation of the plant. And also, I think it was canvassed at the original hearing is that there's some uncertainty in terms of when those connections are going to be happening and the rate of connection as well. So having it tied either to a volume increase or a duration of sort of 5 years sort of means that you get those periods of environmental monitoring occurring regularly.
Yep. So that's 5 houses over the 5 year period.
Sorry?
That's 5 houses over 5 years, you're saying? So every 50, oh no, that's not, so, no, that's not right. I'll take it back. Yeah, I'm just trying to work.
It would be interesting, right? How many connections that would be over that period. Yeah.
Well, from the numbers cited by the standard this morning, there is about 500 still to connect. 319 plus 180 if I jotted down those numbers correctly.
Oh, yeah, because there's 349 that are not connected yet.
You could just clarify, since the thinking of it is 50 others,
Yeah, I just got my order of magnitude wrong. So.
And that's really easy.
Okay. This is in your implications of modelling report, you talked about in the EMP, it included processes for assessing changes in morphology and effects on contaminant transport. And I couldn't see anywhere in the EMP that talked about doing any sort of sediment monitoring, sediment sampling, any sort of depth profiling or anything like that. It was in, referred to section 8.3 of the EMP, but of course section 8.3 doesn't exist in the new EMP. So basically, how are you going to assess changes in morphology? Because it is something that has been brought up, as the potential effects of changes in the bathymetry and therefore potential for moving of sites and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, from my looking at the EMP, that does seem to be an oversight. So I think there is some stuff that we can do over there for longer term.
Yeah.
In terms of checking on bathymetry, particularly from the delta further downstream.
Yeah.
And I'd be happy to support that.
Yeah. Okay. Ms Mill, the council noticed, she made the comment that the sampling regime doesn't align with traditional trigger-based monitoring frameworks and doesn't assist with determining deterioration of trends or deteriorating trends in deterioration. And obviously that's very important. Being able to detect trends is a very important component of the overall EMP. So I'm just wondering what your comments on, what your thoughts on that.
And look, that's something that I've spent a bit of time thinking about as well. So a lot of water quality programs set out a standard approach of monitoring at certain frequencies over a duration to collect a data set with a certain number of samples over a certain period of time. And particularly in relationship to water quality guidelines, they are average data predominantly collected over 4 or 5 years of relatively consistent monitoring. Because it became evident both in terms of our work and the previous hearing that there was a lot of focus around situations where conditions were at their most sensitive, so those periods where loads of highest environmental conditions were most sensitive. What became evident from the modelling was that variation of nitrogen concentrations over each tidal cycle, which didn't tend to be picked up by the previous monitoring that we've done. So I looked at refocusing that in terms of much higher frequency over that tidal cycle to get an idea of nitrogen concentrations or nitrogen and other concentrations over each cycle. In terms of being able to assess over, repeating that even over the baseline period of sort of 4 years prior to commissioning of the treatment plant and 4 years later, I had discussed this with one of our statisticians in the house, and he believes that there is an approach in terms of testing hypothesis on whether there is a trend, increasing trend in concentrations or not. Proof of the pudding will be in the meeting when we get that information as well. So I find it probably a wee bit challenging before the fact to be able to present to the hearings and to the regional council program officers exactly how we would assess the data in the absence of having the data available to us.
And I guess that's part of the problem, isn't it, in absence of data, of baseline data. Yeah. So, yeah, and I'm chopping and changing a little bit because I've been through to the documents here. So I will probably come back and this thing. The triggers, yeah, it's not very clear where they will apply, when they start. Like, do they start from the first year of monitoring, for example? And how an exceedance will be determined and over what time frame. So I know there's a lot in that question, but basically, how do you apply the trigger framework in a real world situation? And obviously, we've all read the EP, so we're really familiar with what's in there.
Just got to refresh myself. So I think the question of where the triggers apply is covered off in the
And
again.
what's the answer?
Well, the trigger levels will apply.
Because the reason I picked up on that one is because you actually, in your, I think it's in the supplementary evidence, you say something about the triggers 1 to 5 all sites and then something like that. So it's a bit of confusion there.
Yes, okay. Now,
Well, let's just sort of stick with where will they apply?
so they'll apply to all of the sites that we're monitoring for water quality. I'm not suggesting that all of those sites are negative this. I'm not implying that there needs to be an exceedance of the trigger levels for all of the sites that
No,
we're
I
monitoring for
understand.
any action to be taken.
Yeah.
But then again, I think there needs to be a degree of sort of flexibility to say, well, if we are exceeding a trigger, let's say at Matarangi, for instance, what is the thought processes that we need to go through? So that's around, what is the exceedance? Are we seeing anything in terms of the ecological monitoring that might indicate that an elevated or above trigger level nitrogen concentration or going down concentration, whether those ecological parameters are implicated by an elevated concentration or not. And that again is something that we won't know until we've got both pieces of information in front of us. How they will apply, but again, I wouldn't necessarily think that let's say after the first year of baseline monitoring, if we had an exceedance of a trigger level over that data set, that would immediately launch into a response action. That might be that it does, but again, it depends on that sort of nexus between what we're seeing in the water column and what we're measuring in the communicated tidal area. Conversely, if we had that repeated over both sampling events, then that may well trigger us to do more work. If we had a one-off event first year, to give you an example, I don't think I'd be over. Depends on the concentrations that we're seeing, and those concentrations in relationship to the control sites, both upstream and downstream, may not cause me any cause for concern.
So sorry to interrupt, I just wanted to make it clear. So you're saying that, what I understand you saying is that you wouldn't if there was no ecological response, then at the time because I understand you're going to try and do the ecological monitoring within a few weeks of the water quality monitoring, so you can have some reading. So, so what you're saying is if there's no ecological response, regardless of whether there's a trigger of water quality, the exceedance of a water quality trigger, that wouldn't trigger a further investigation. So the reason I ask that is because that infers that you have a really good understanding of the relationship between water quality and the various ecological parameters. And I haven't seen any evidence of that.
No, I wouldn't necessarily say that either would or a water thing. Both need to be informed by.
But what you're saying is that you need to have an ecological response before you make a response to a water quality trigger, which almost makes the water quality trigger redundant. So I think you need to be very careful here.
I'm not necessarily saying that you look at just the triggers in isolation. It may be that with the water quality, the measurements of water quality may well respond to an exceedance of the trigger level.
Yeah.
But it does need to. There's not a lot that the consent holder could do if we found after a period of 2 or 3 years that we're getting elevated TN that might exceed the trigger levels, and we're not necessarily seeing an ecological response there, because the conundrum that we're facing is, is an exceedance of a trigger level for nitrogen, for instance, does that in itself present an adverse effect?
But it's implying a very simplistic relationship, and also doesn't account for lags in responses and the actual, natural environment. Yeah. So I'm really struggling to see what the relevance of water quality triggers actually is, if the concern is around the ecological response.
Well, it's the link between what comes out of the wastewater treatment plant and any ecological response.
Yeah, no, I understand. I understand the linkages. For one thing, those linkages, what you're talking about between the water quality and the ecological triggers, is not clear in the AMP in terms of how, and I guess that comes to this question of, and the experts, the other council experts picked up on that too, that there's not enough detail in the EMP to have an understanding of actually how you apply it. And I guess that's the questions that we're interested in asking. And the reason we're interested in having the answers is because this comes back to understanding effects, and for us to be confident that the EMP is going to address our concerns around adverse effects. So I kind of feel like, I don't know if either of you want to chip in on this, but I do feel like it's something that you need to give a lot of thought to. But I don't want to labour on it because I'm very conscious of time. Perhaps that's something that perhaps you can just
I guess maybe is are the triggers the most efficient and the most targeted for what you're wanting to identify as effects?
I'll take away Commissioner Phillips' point around uncertainty. I think in terms of sort of responding to your question, what's sort of exercise in my mind at the moment is that could we have an effective monitoring program without any monitoring of water quality, environmental monitoring of water quality? So then we do just rely on the discharge standards and ecological sort of response mechanisms. I think if we ended up with an exceedance or a trend or an exceedance of a particular ecological threshold or movement from one band to the other, there's uncertainty in terms of what's causing that. So we do need some form of water.
Oh, I agree entirely. I would be very upset. You need the water quality. It's just about then using that as a mechanism for deciding on when you have a response to it comes back to what's the relevance of the purpose of the water quality triggers. Yeah, so thank you.
So, and look, just to answer your question in terms of one being in the modelling, or the technical memo that followed the modelling. It's something that does provide us with an early warning before there is an ecological response. So there will, there's potentially a latency period between elevated nutrient concentrations and an ecological response. But I do think we need to be careful in terms of, from a management response point of view, how we enact that if there has to be exceedance in water.
Yeah, sure. Anyway, I think you really need to think about that. This is just me being pedantic. Is trigger values and trigger levels are both mentioned in the EMP and also in the conditions. So are they levels? Are they different?
I'm not saying that it's different.
No, that's what I thought. But it's just that. Yeah, I know it's pedantic, but again, it's a.
The same thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
In your, sorry, moving on to your evidence, I think supplementary evidence, I should say, not your chief. In paragraph 3.2, I'll just give you a minute to get there. You mentioned, and this is when you're talking about possible responses, you talk about environmental mitigation or compensation. And I was just interested to know what that would look like.
If you're possibly referring to...
Am I referring to the wrong one? Supplementary.
Yeah, you're referring to...
To my rebuttal, I beg your pardon, sorry. It was on the top of the previous page. Rebuttal, sorry, paragraph 3.2.
So I suppose some of the environmental mitigation options are included in B and C above. So
okay, so what? So then, but you've got it as a separate entry, I should say. So obviously you must have been thinking about something else as well.
I was thinking about mitigation options that we necessarily covered in B and C, but
yeah, exactly.
more thought into what that might be.
And what about compensation?
Well, again, there's the potential ability to look at compensation in terms of either offsetting an effect by doing something else in the rest of the estuary to address an effect, or some other form of sort of more direct, as we understand it from a biodiversity compensation in terms of applying something else to a different environment.
Like for example, restoration of the wetland. Just be careful what you can your client to.
Yeah.
But again, for that, in terms of, I'm not wanting to if there was ever a situation that arose, that I guess we want to forego looking at other opportunities in terms of addressing an issue if it had to arise.
I think you guys might have a question about this one. I've got one more question on that, and then of that. So in paragraph 3.4, you talk about removal of sediments. So this is in your rebuttal, and the need for consent. And my question is, so is it therefore appropriate to propose an option, given that it may or may not be possible? And this leads into this more broader question, which I think the Chair and Tiffany will want, is about shouldn't the options that are actually included in the EMP, things that can actually be achieved and that will be effective?
That might be more a planning question, but
I think this is just a common sense question, isn't it? I'm being too rough.
No. but no, I don't believe in that.
Well, I guess it's because it was in your, I guess that I'm asking you because it was in your, you know, you put it in your evidence, so.
No, look, I don't believe that's the case, and this is around, we're dealing with also messages from submitters that say, look, can you have a look at a discharge location? And you've heard from various points saying, but this isn't on the table. But certainly the discharge location from a technical point of view is something that I think the consent holder should consider.
That's fair enough. Okay, thank you. Just like this was on your piece.
Oh, okay, just further on that, then the discharge location is identified as, RSA in the EMP as an action, a response action. So, can you explain, and I think sort of this has been just touched on now, explain how that would work as a response action? It's actually the EMP on page 42 of ours, and it's under 7.3, response plan. And then it says the initial response plan shall set out the timing, scope, and recommendations for further monitoring, proposed remedial actions to include, but must explicitly consider the following remedial actions. So that's got quite a lot of strength to it, and that includes the third bullet point, changing the discharge location to avoid sensitive habitats. So is there anyone that can advise on how that would be done and what's involved in that?
Well, we've done some preliminary work on changing the discharge location in terms of discharge downstream of the Matarangi stream delta, and that effectively means that that restriction of tidal exchange of the stream delta constrains sediment dilution. That constriction is removed, so we're effectively discharging into the main body of the estuary rather than the Matarangi itself. So that's one outcome. There are other outcomes that TCDC could look at, but effectively, what we're wanting in terms of that explicitness is for them to address it and either address it amongst other options, and either propose to increase with that or several other options, or not.
It seems it seems like it's not very, it's implicit in here, but it hasn't got the weight. And if that discharge location was a better alternative, why wouldn't it be looked at now? I'm not saying it is or it isn't, because we don't know, but if it's shown to be part of a response plan, you would, well, I would assume that it's a better option because you're responding to some issues that are going on, and this is seen to be a way of positively responding. So why wouldn't that option and design feature be in the design now? Yeah, be great. It's a sort of an open, yeah.
So a lot of that information has come about through this process for this application and in response to comments from submitters. So modelling, when that was set up, we did run through that suggestion of running a discharge down a different range. So through the modelling and work with Peter and Fiona, it became evident that that would be a very real way to mitigate or reduce the adverse effects in this particular discharge location. But we don't have scope for that right now, and it's certainly something council can look at. At the moment, we're coming through this very long process that we've been in, and so that's certainly something that can be considered. And I guess a lot of what the work is showing is that there's a lot of uncertainty around when the demand will come for additional houses at Matarangi, and so it's horses for courses, and whether you're investing in something that isn't necessary right now. And so those responses may not be required for, I don't know, 5 years, they might be not required for 15 years, we don't know when it will come. And so if the monitoring, the environmental monitoring shows that the effects are acceptable, we're not having adverse effects, significant adverse effects or more than minor adverse effects, then there isn't the driver necessarily to go and put in another application and do all the work that would be required to support another application for a consent.
Yeah,
To discharge in a different location.
Yeah, that's right. I think what you've touched on is that's exactly sort of where we're at also, is not really knowing what the effects are still. That I think usefully is not for water quality, not toxicity, but it runs over to ecological, which we'll get to. But it does still seem that this management plan is a means of identifying what the effects are. And that's leaving us a little bit uncomfortable. I'm not sure how we get that more certainty around what the effects are, whether it's the baseline work or, but it's evident that there is potential for adverse effects, and that will only presumably be known once more work is done on the like the trigger levels and the monitoring, and then that might lead into these alternate measures.
To respond to your question, I think the same situation arises for a discharge in a different location. Because while the modelling suggests we've got better mixing than we haven't done all of the work that would consider that either. So we may be in exactly the same position in a different location.
Right, which sort of feeds back into why you didn't have it in a response plan.
Because you don't go to the extent of that detail of assessing every possible option of every, when you're working through a best practical option, and this application represents the best practical option that the Matarangi Wastewater will ever came up with. So when that work was done, all of the options that were on the table were taken to that detailed level, because it's a significant investment to consider the effects of.
Well, if you haven't done the work on the alternate discharge location, why would you have it in as a response action? Because the response actions are pretty important, aren't they? They're going to address any exceedances in those trigger levels, so they need to be comfort and certainty that they're going to address it and work. But the ones that are listed here, or that one in particular stood out to me is that one, is it going to work? And if it is going to work, why would it not be working now? And that was
I understand.
read of it.
Can I just pick up on your comment about, you're unsure about when more connections will be needed and everything. I'm just picking up on the modelling, which is already predicting that towards the end of what I assume is just a linear, I don't know exactly whether it's just straight, but what's a linear increase in discharge and volume, isn't it? It wasn't a demand-driven, there were sort of assumptions about demand. So the modelling is already predicting towards the end of the 35-year period that there will be exceedances. So why aren't you already know, based on current knowledge, which is quite limited, the water quality data is quite limited. So just pick up your point about we're not sure about when the needs tap or connections, therefore, do you want to invest in this early or later? But you already know there is some information out there already about what the water quality is likely to be in the future. So what I'm getting at is why is that not a driver for seriously considering some of these alternatives?
Sorry, I'm not really understanding your question.
So the water quality, the modelling, the water quality modelling is predicting that there will be there's a potential for elevated total nitrogen concentrations in the lower part of the estuary and upper part of the estuary. Towards the end of the consent. So you already know that you're going to have some problems you're going to be dealing with. So whereas I took from your discussion about why an alternative discharge location hadn't been considered further was because of the uncertainty around when you have the demand, and therefore what the load will be. Because if demand drives the amount, the load, and therefore, so what I'm saying is that the modelling is already saying that there will be effects, there could be effects that will need to be managed. And we're talking about, and these are different management, so these are response to adverse effects. So I didn't really understand why you were saying the drive wasn't there for investment in an alternative discharge option.
So conceivably, there could be no further development of Matarangi, maybe other additional blocks, in which case you don't need a response because nothing's going to be showing up and you're monitoring that you're needing to have a response to anything. So we've looked at the worst case scenario, so full development by the end of the term of consent, which is, I think is a reasonable worst case scenario. You can't do any more development and then there's land available to develop in that area. So
worst case scenario would be if that development happens in 5 years rather than 10 years.
Exactly.
So there are sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah. So I guess, that was my comment about having a response. So you've got consent, and you just try and use the right language here. You've got consent limits, you've got trigger levels, and you have responses. And so, in my mind, you don't need a response if you're not having a trigger.
But I guess this isn't so much I guess it comes back to whether that particular response is appropriate. I guess Australia is talking. Is that appropriate as a response to a trigger?
Yeah, because it opens up another sort of consent, for example, and more modelling and more assessment.
And time frame as well.
Yeah,
how long will it take?
Seems to change. It's quite a big response to trigger levels, I would have thought. But reading it, that it's in there, I assumed that it was therefore a practical and logical way to respond, but I'm not sure.
So perhaps I think what you've highlighted is how that section's been drafted.
Yeah.
It's a drafting challenge rather than, and I think that's very helpful to highlight that.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, this is contemplating some longer-term solutions. I mean, the footnote says some of these options may require resource consent statutory approval.
Yeah.
So if the mindset that's taken into reading it is this is an immediate fix, we should cross it out. I mean,
Are these responses to long-term, are they long-term solutions? The responses is meant to be, I thought, was a response to a trigger. Whether it's a long-term,
That's what he's saying.
is that what you're saying?
So that if it, like changing the dispatch location is not an immediate response.
I guess that's what.
it's a draft.
Yeah. But my confusion is also are these responses? What are they responding to? Because the way that the environment management plan is structured, these are meant to be addressing chronic, longer-term effects, right? Not acute, not short-term effects. So therefore, the responses need to be proportionate to the effects, if you like. And so I guess that's what we're getting to. So I'm just talking out loud trying to understand this. So, okay.
You speak a lot of truth, Brian. I just otherwise what I was thinking of. I'm putting it down so I don't have any questions like what I asked you before we go to what I mean. So, and I guess a related point, of course, but where we in this Oswald both submitted, you know, like, look at a different place. So I heard the plans to be that's why we were there. And I think this what we consider added to the list of future responses and the response plan. That one would be able to cover locations on page. Choose a different location, food volunteers can would require further change of driver to consider an alternate location. Or another example, say the development potential at Matarangi is not realised, so again, doesn't have a trigger that causes the change location to be
However, I don't think that it doesn't read as we're saying, it doesn't read as a response because the response should be not immediate, but certainly achievable in the short term, and which I'm not sure if I should digress at the moment, but while we're on the response plan, my read of it is there's a lot of investigation, plan, report. It's a long way down until you get to actual actions, and then one of the actions is something that isn't necessarily achievable. So the response actions and the response plans, of which there are a number of response plans, there's an initial one and a final one and something else, are they going to, I'm not sure who this is to, but are they going to, all those plans, going to, and when is it going to achieve, and to alleviate the trigger that's been, or the effect that's been triggered? Could be so far down the track that it's not effective. That's my read of the plans, the remedial plans, but both better and or how would it work? It just seems to be a lot of preparation, investigation, reporting, and then finally get to a response and some actions. Doesn't seem very immediate.
That's probably more of a Peter Cochrane question in terms of implementing a response and
and look, that's addressed to some extent in 4.2 of my rebuttal evidence in terms of timeframes to develop the response plan. And I agree with you on sort of face value. There's a degree of complexity in the interim.
Seems to be a lot of steps before you get any actions.
There does, but there is some time around going from that initial response to coming up with some pretty good plans in terms of how to respond to it. I think you sort of you run the risk in terms of us needing to test any response plan with the regional council, and for them to have a degree of comfort that we'll achieve the outcome that we're seeking as well. So it's it doesn't end up being a one-step process.
And you're 4.2, and this is in response to submitters, what they raised, that the ENP would require a response plan to be developed within 120 days of a trigger being reached. But that to be developed, a plan to be developed, is still not actually an action plan being implemented. So it's still within 120 days that the action will be undertaken. You're just developing a plan.
Second sentence says, you can't finish this day.
Yeah.
And that action plan is one that over 120 days there would be further understanding of the effect of that trigger, developing a response plan, having that in front of the regional council for them to review, and then to finalise that in terms of some concrete measures and consent. Because the government themselves too now, I can't be in the position of saying how quickly that they can implement those concrete measures, because at this stage we don't know what those concrete measures might be.
Would that plan, which I think that's would that impact the environmental outcomes? You know, does that, you've identified this adverse effect, so that will continue. So what is the implication of that, having that adverse effect continuing for an unknown period?
It depends on the nature of the adverse effect. So,
can I just clarify something? So I thought that the point of the triggers was that you don't detect. It's a trigger for, there won't necessarily be an adverse effect, but it's a trigger to say there might be an adverse effect and therefore reduce. Is that correct?
yeah.
Yeah, so it's not, it
okay.
won't,
Yeah.
it's not
So
really
it's gonna be
detecting
heads
adverse.
up.
I just want to clarify.
Yeah, I think it's
Thank you.
So part of the response might be the response.
No, you do.
No, I mean,
Oh, no, that's what I mean.
well, if there's a potential for an adverse effect, then there should be a response.
Oh,
The response
the
might
response would be
be
doing the investigation and decide whether something needs to be done. I was extrapolating what need to be done as a response. Which is not so bad.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, Peter, just interrupt you.
well, maybe that answers it, that you have to go through all those steps to determine whether there is going to be an adverse effect that is worthy and requiring further action.
And in the interim, there's the proposed consent condition around there, allowing no further increases, which I think is a reasonable step to take. And when we're talking about the range of options that were available back in 3.2, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that, although Mr. Deshpande said that the degree of treatment provided by the wastewater treatment plant is probably the best the industry can provide. In 25 years, it might be different. So improving wastewater treatment could well be an option to consider, either in terms of dealing with the quality or the quantity of the discharge.
So those action points are really for long-term overview responses and go to, rather than immediate, like, immediate action points.
Well, some of it could be immediate. And first one is obviously holding the volume of wastewater that's discharged.
Because wouldn't it depend on the nature of the trigger that's been, because if it's something that actually, even a small change can lead to quite a significant effect in a short time. I know we're not talking about acute, but we are talking about, so surely it would depend on that as well.
Yeah.
Can I just ask, this is me being a bit pedantic again, but I've come across this quite a bit. In places you say, generally speaking, you being the wider you say when a trigger is met or reached, and then other times you say when a trigger is exceeded. They actually mean different things, don't they? So what is it? Is it met or exceeded?
Well, I think both, because we won't know until we've done the monitoring.
Well, I guess in terms of when it is triggered, is it when it's met or when it's, if the trigger is 5, is it when it's 5 or is it when it's 5.1? That is quite, I mean, that's obviously pretty extreme. Yeah, okay, because it exceeded is used quite a bit, but then reached is occasionally used.
Right, sure, there's a trend to indicate that we might get there in terms of that such in the future.
Thank you. I just have a little question. Sorry. You might want to pick up I just have a little question about why only 4 years before, when the commission, it's going to be 5 years before. What happens in that first year?
We're not necessarily proposing to do anything, and that might be up to the PTBC to respond to that.
So why not? Why wouldn't you start monitoring straight away?
From a technical point of view, I see no reason why.
Yeah. So I'm just reading through my notes. Oh yes, and I'm looking at the EMP now, section 3, response plans, and this wording, the first sentence says this is described in section 2.2, a trigger system, and I assume that that's trigger and threshold, because we do triggers and thresholds, those words. It's used to define environmental criteria that signal changes may be occurring outside of what is anticipated or where action is required to avoid certain effects before they become overly damaging. This is what overly damaging means. Section 3, there aren't, in fact, page number, I don't know if you realise, page number starts with something like 25. So section 3, the first section, sentence under response plans. Just that last wording, overly damaging, I sort of wondered what that meant, because it to me implies there's a level of damage of it allowable. I'm not sure that's not what you meant.
I think that's what we actually.
Yeah. Yeah, and then on that same page at F, and I think this is maybe in the consent anyway, an outline of a proposed remedial actions and implementation plan and time frame to address confirmed adverse effect that may be caused an adverse effect on the environment. I was just wondering how you confirm that. What's your way of doing that? Confirming there may be an adverse effect that might cause an adverse effect. How do you confirm it?
And part of that's addressed by further investigations that you might need to do. So, again, I'll go back to water quality triggers if you're looking at getting towards or one of those trigger levels that might require a response that has to look at a range of ecological parameters in terms of are we seeing a response in the environment as a result of that nutrient pressure. And that's what I mean by confirming whether that is or has the potential to resolve and affect its performance.
Well, I guess it's that, basically the way that I read this is that you won't take remedial actions until you've confirmed that there could be adverse effects. And it's just a timing thing, I think. It's like, it's a trigger. It's a trigger for a response. But if you're going to take the time to take some time to determine whether there's possibly an adverse effect, even though I thought the whole point of the trigger was that's triggering that there possibly was an adverse effect. So haven't you already confirmed that by just simply triggering, having a trigger value? So why do you need to confirm it again?
Well,
See what I mean?
Depends on that nexus between water quality and ecological.
And then that comes back to the point of what is the point of the water quality triggers if you don't then respond to the water quality triggers? Sorry.
No.
Again, sorry.
Yeah, no,
but it's, you know, it's just, it's got to be logical, and I just don't see the value of the water quality. I do see the value of the water quality triggers, but I don't see how requiring there to be an ecological response linked to it basically at the same time for it to trigger. Because otherwise, what's the point of the water quality triggers? Oh, I beg your pardon. It was 3. It was on that same. I did say on that same page. It was 3F. Beg your pardon. So yeah, maybe that's just something you need to give some thought to.
No, I think I understand the question that you're asking.
Yeah, thank you. Should we just
I guess it's because there's quite a bit resting on the and for our benefit, we would like certainty and comfort that it is going to work and that it is a document that can be used to achieve what it's meant to achieve. So, you know, just digging down into the detail, but what I think, it's the detail that those things down. So, it's just understanding how it's going to work and if it's going to work to its objective.
Yeah, and sort of related to that, I guess, is the frequency of monitoring sufficient to be able to confirm effects or a potential for effect? It doesn't seem like you're going to have a lot of data.
Over the term of that baseline period, like 4 years before and then 4 years after commissioning, there will be a substantial amount of water quality data that is available. Again, as I said earlier on, it won't be standard monthly.
But it's just going to be for that peak period, though, isn't it? It's going to be
which is environmental, like 6th time of the year, environmental loads and highs. So that includes, that assumes an assumption that over the periods in between time when wastewater loads are lower and environmental conditions are less sensitive, there is no effect.
And just to clarify, so my understanding is that these triggers will apply from the start of the consent, not from the commissioning. So these triggers actually apply to the discharge as it is for the next 4 or 5 years. Is that correct?
They'll apply from day one, but how they're applied might change. So it might be over the first period of time. Until such time as we know what the data is, it's very difficult for me to say how we would respond.
But you're having annual summary reports, and surely as part of that you check compliance and make sure that there's no triggers. You're not triggering those, you're not exceeding those triggers, surely. But they would apply in the first year, sure. Yeah. Just wanted to clarify that.
Did we get an answer?
I think the answer is yes. Is that correct? The answer is yes, they will. Yes. You think the answer is yes. So
The answer is yes.
Thank you. I noticed, just generally speaking, I'm going, but I noticed, just generally that there are some inconsistencies and sort of dates and some of the stuff in the EMP. In fact, in the conditions that are at the back, they are not the version that, there are some differences in the version in the EMP versus what the final version conditions that we presented. So,
we'll get an opportunity to go to conditions maybe with, Ms. Clayton.
yes, so I'll just focus on the technical.
Maybe in the meantime, I'll just, while we're on the development commission, 5.3, the baseline monitoring. Is it that, and I think in 1.1 it also says baseline data will be established by the end of the first 8 years of consent, and then 5.3 sets out the baseline, which says there also a minimum period of 4 years to the commissioning of the new plant. So does that mean that there isn't, well, I think we canvassed this morning as well, there isn't the baseline monitoring, baseline information available at the moment. So this process will fill in that gap.
There is some information that was presented in the ADE and I spoke to the maintenance and the chief. That's getting a wee bit off now. So I think this will help in terms of updating and understanding. We'll build on the water quality model that's been undertaken. It includes a sort of a shift in the location of the sites that we will be monitoring and how we monitor those.
This sort of goes to the basis of the adaptive management plan that, as I understood, and from the case law that was provided, that baseline monitoring should be available before you get into an adaptive management plan. That's sort of one of the criteria that was in the case law. How is the lack of full baseline information here going to impact the ability to do the adaptive management plan? Is it going to? Because would you need that baseline information for the adaptive management plan that is implemented?
Again, it's a matter of degrees in terms of what that information tells us. And you know, that is an area of uncertainty for us. I think what the commissioning of the wastewater treatment plant does provides a period of time when we're able to establish that baseline. We're able to continue monitoring after the commissioning of the new wastewater treatment plants when we are looking at a reduction in contaminant loads to the environment as well. And that will help inform us in terms of both what water quality looks like, but also if there's any logical response. So
it seems almost like a step that the next 4 years after if a consent was granted, is the gathering of more information, more modelling, done quite a bit already, but there seem to be some gaps and some uncertainty there. You fill in those gaps over the next 4 years, and then does that inform an adaptive management plan rather than using the adaptive management plan as the baseline monitoring vehicle? Because it seems to be contrary to what the advice that we've been getting in the case law that was provided, that the adaptive management plan relies on adequate baseline data before you can go into the adaptive management plan. That will make sense. Yeah, it sort of seems more of a step rather than launch straight into the adaptive management plan.
I don't don't think we could just blindly do baseline monitoring for the next 4 years and then 4 years following the commissioning of the wastewater treatment plant and be oblivious to what that monitoring is telling us. So that would help us to pull that baseline, but within that period of time, there still be conditions that Mr. Filter's talked about that might be sensitive, that we may need to look at what the effect of that on water quality and ecological response is going to be. So I wouldn't necessarily support us not doing anything sort of 4 to 8 years.
No. It was more timing and staging of the various actions that are within the EMP, and it seems that baseline monitoring is number one, really, to fill in the gaps from what you've done to date, and from there to have a better understanding moving forward into both the design and what the effects are and the responses to those effects.
But we'd certainly know more at the end of 4 years, and we'll know more at the end of the post-commissioning period of monitoring as well.
Just conscious of the time.
Yeah, I know. Just on, can you just explain why sections 5.42, 4.3, 5.43 and 5.44 are included, because they actually are all about the modelling approach. So I didn't understand why they would be in this monitoring report. It's just all about the stuff that's actually from Mr. Filter's report.
We're in the
It's in the EMP. I'm just totally in the EMP. 5.4.2 to 5.4.4. I just didn't understand why they were in there, why that was in there. It's any relevance to the monitoring report. I mean, maybe just think about that one. Because it's all about the modelling.
Well, no, not necessarily. This was the rationale. This is outlined the rationale to the water quality.
But 5.4.3 is all about the assumptions of the model in the model.
Sorry?
Isn't 5.4.3 all about the assumptions in the model?
No, this is the assumptions that we would need to make in terms of interpreting and monitoring.
All right.
Maybe they're the same thing.
No, not necessarily.
I don't think they are.
So what is 5.43 assumptions related to?
So the program of monitoring that we've proposed is based on some assumptions. So we're assuming that, for instance, that over the monitoring period, things like bathymetry and morphology remain the same. We're assuming that the wastewater discharge load is stable over that sampling cycle, so it's not varying wildly. That we're assuming that the period that we're wanting to capture is indeed that worst case situation. So it's all those, that's what comes out of the modelling that helps inform us in terms of modelling and the assumptions that we're needing to make in terms of the monitoring that we're doing.
I think the bit that confused me was the last one, limitations and effects, which actually does talk about the model. So the model outputs.
But wouldn't there be modelling that's done as part of the water assumptions? Or,
Well, but it's not a given that modelling.
Oh, sorry, what section is that?
5.4.4, limitations and risks. It actually talks about this model alone cannot differentiate whether it actually mentions the word model. And scope of output, this model outputs the station. That's why I was confused.
No, we're more talking around the correction monitoring. So, we've established a conceptual model.
The approach, okay, that's the confusion.
given that we're on 5.43 assumptions, I've got just a question here, what happens if assumptions can't be met?
Good question. So if assumptions can't be met, then there's, that would, cause us to have a look at reviewing the monitoring program. Is it the purpose of some of those assumptions can't be met? Also, that means that, we would need to test some of those assumptions remain validated and accurate as well. Now, maybe that if we're saying that, let's say, for example, there is significant changes in the definition of the history, we would need to go back and look at the implications of that in terms of time that's changed.
How do you know that?
Again, I think one of the earlier questions, and it's sort of covered off in the monitoring plan, but on a regular basis, and it might be 2 years or something like that, do something in terms of rechecking whether the definition has remained stable. Now, that might be something simple as just looking at aerial photographs and might require more detailed survey. But it's being open to those things that might change, exchange over that period of time.
A little document, isn't it?
Just jumping ahead to 5.6.1.3, assessing habitat ecological state. I guess when I looked at this table and the proposal in terms of the shifts, I did struggle with that, partly because I don't know, there's nothing to indicate what the metric is, what you're measuring. I know you're measuring the total nitrogen, but over what time period, how many samples, whether it's a median, an average, but also it struck me that what happens if you do 4 years of baseline monitoring, and each year your values end up being in a different band, or you might have two different. So it might be good 1 year, then it's poor the next year, and it's good 1 year, and then it's poor the next year. What do you then determine about what your current state is? How do you deal with that? Because that's a possibility. I mean, it's probably extreme,
Yes.
but I'm just trying to think about how this works, because to me that reflects understanding how this works, and I'm not sure how it works. So.
Yeah, that's a big question. So you're asking me to answer based on that hypothetical situation?
How does it work? How would this work? Like, you do your year one report, and you get and you do a summary report, I understand. And so presumably you do some assessment then of, what is that telling you? So you do that every year. And then I understood the first 4 years was the pre-commissioning baseline. So you'd have a report at the end of that 4 years, which is a bit fuller. And then you do 4 years after that, same thing, annual report, summary reports, and your 4 year, and then you do this big, after 8 years, whole thing, so you can start looking at trends. So I'm just trying to work out what that's going to look like in terms of informing understanding of the current state and picking up any potential effects, including during that first 4 years when you're discharging prior to commissioning. So there's a lot of stuff. But anyway. So.
Yeah.
The question is, how is this going to work? Because is the problem because you don't have baseline data? You're not able to say with any surety whether these limit or these trigger values are actually relevant, appropriate. Is that what it is?
Well, I mean, that's why we haven't set specific trigger values, because we don't have that baseline data right now.
I guess I saw these as trigger values.
Oh, yeah, so these values that are in table 5, which I think is what you're...
Or thresholds, sorry.
Yeah, what you're pointing to have come... sorry, my new documents.
Yeah.
So those
thresholds. I didn't just make those up.
No,
Yeah.
I
Yes,
understand where they all that comes from. That's not the question. I understand that.
Yeah.
What I understand is how, what I don't understand is how you're going to then decide whether there's been a significant effect or an adverse effect, or likely then, should I say, potentially an adverse effect, because that's the whole point of it.
Yes.
It's about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this was the point that the regional council staff put up to, and it's a, you know, absolutely valid, and I understand the uncertainty with not having any baseline data. But yes, you know, in my mind, the way we would approach this once we've had that first year of data was to be like, okay, well, like, for example, you know, if we were in, you know, the upper end, like, so the upper end of like a moderate state for more, you know, multiple of those parameters, then the amount of change you would accept in terms of determining whether there's an unacceptable change. Well, okay, so sorry, I'll start again. So once you've got that first year of data, you would use that as the starting point from which to determine what those next thresholds would be for the following years. Yeah. And that is because we don't know where it sits right now. Hypothetically, if we were in a situation where multiple of those parameters were, you know, close to between moderate and poor threshold bands that are in that table, then the degree of change relative to that would be a lot smaller that you would accept before you triggered a response than if you were, you know, in the good to moderate. That was
So
my thinking.
You're actually weighting it.
Yeah, that's where my thinking
relative
was.
to how close it is to tripping over into a lower.
Because at the end of the day, you know, we don't want to see if the extreme hardware in as stressed a state as, or, you know, or closely in stressed a state as some of the submitters are concerned about, which is, you know, they just want to protect their environment, protect their home grounds and all that kind of thing. We don't want to say, oh, you know, well, it's all good, like just carry on as usual. But I just can't give a different answer about what that degree of change looks like right now because I don't have. So yeah, it would be a weighted, like I said, it would be a weighted response in one of those first reports. And my intention is to do that collaboratively with the council. Yeah.
That's helpful. I guess if we get. Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay.
Yes. We kind of have in a way because in as much as that the questions that are related more to that logical sort of thing. But I can hold on.
Well, if we're leaving Mr. Cochrane in terms of, I don't have anything more, but you might have.
But I don't think.
We can come back to, but maybe it's useful because we're still on the NP to go to functionality of evidence and then that feeds into the NP questions as well.
If we're on a roll, just looking through chapter 9 of these submissions, that traverses quite a bit of the stuff that has been subject questions already this afternoon. I don't need to present that, we just want to keep going. But would it be helpful in that case, in order we don't provide in the middle of the conversation, for Ms. McIntosh to get read her summary, maybe draw attention to anything that she may have heard that she could respond to before we answer questions.
No, I definitely want that summary.
Yeah.
Sorry, so am I reading out?
Yeah.
Yes, and as Barry sort of indicated, if you can sort of touch on points that you over the afternoon as well, if that's relevant.
Yeah, maybe it's not going to be on maybe. Oh, this is my rebuttal, not. That's right. Oh, no, it's okay. So following the adjournment of the hearing in July 2024, the Thames Primary officers and independent experts engaged in extensive discussions with regional council experts, and hydrodynamic modelling has been completed as has been discussed by Mr. Coulter. As a result, it became evident that different parts of the receiving environments could be more prone to receiving high total nitrogen loads than previously anticipated. And those areas are the intertidal wetland habitat located upstream of the Matarangi Bridge. Because those areas weren't part of the scope of the ECIA back in 2020, so no one had visited them, so they had been characterised at all in any way. I undertook a site visit to those areas on the 6th of November and looked at obvious indicators, and by obvious I mean growth in patterns in plants, or whether there was any presence of any algae on the surface, or indications of toxicity in sediment, again through growth in the plants, that could have occurred as a result of eutrophication toxicity, and that should be subject to further investigation, or which point case and extended point that might be related to the discharge. What I noted was, in some of the areas I visited, that there were some indicators that could, so there were some plant growth characteristics that could be indicative of nutrient enrichment in places, but not throughout the entire area, shown as being potentially pressured by the modelling. However, there were other adjoining land factors that could also be related to what I saw in terms of those vegetation growth patterns. As a result of that site visit, discussion with the regional council experts, and the results of the hydrodynamic modelling and water quality analysis, Mr. Cochran and I updated the draft UMP, and I think previously we had suggested 3 years pre and 3 years post upgrade for the monitoring, and we've extended it out to 8 years. A list of adaptive management triggers, which we've just been discussing, and I put together a technical framework of how the changing environmental parameters might indicate a change from low effects of the environment to moderate or higher impact. And as we just discussed, it was based on a hypothetical scenario, because because we don't have existing baseline data, but it was also in response to a comment by Regional Council that they wanted to see how that, like we just asked, how that could work in practice. One of the other additions made to the EMP was the provision of initial and final response plans, as again we've just been discussing, and that the initial stage of those response plans focuses on further investigation and monitoring to confirm the extent and cause of any triggers that have been triggered, and proposes provisional remedial actions and mitigation along with the timeframes for submitting final plans. The final stage formalises those actions and attempts to provide a framework to ensure that there's compliance and effectiveness. As I've just discussed, needs more work there, but some of the options we suggested were improving treatment quality, timing of the discharge, and storage. So in response to the Section 42A report prepared by the Council, I agree that the EMP needs to be written in a way that ensures robust data collection and that the triggers are well defined, and that so we need some more work on that. But I do think that we, by identifying those with good data, we can manage those remaining uncertainties. Again, we've made adjustments to the EMP to address the issues that have been raised. We removed, well, I guess we clarified some of the layout of the EMP, removing segment and market data from seeming to be a key parameter for triggering a response to being a supporting parameter. I accept and support the recommendations made by Mr. Townsend about additional and nested macroalgal monitoring. If the initial monitoring plan that we had in the EMP suggests there is regular use of macroalgal growth, so we can change the EMP to include that. However, I consider that one of the recommendations about having a certain chlorophyll A trigger level in the conditions was too conservative, and like the rest of the EMP needed to be based on our baseline monitoring. So in conclusion, like although there's some work that's been to be done on EMP and the modelling indicates that the potential risk areas have changed, what we initially saw as potential challenging areas that need to be managed, I think that they can still be managed through the environmental monitoring plan, and with the upgrades of the wastewater treatment plant, I don't necessarily see that there's going to be any any greater impact on the receiving environment than there currently is. So that's paraphrasing.
Yeah, no, that's all right. At that point, so on that conclusion, I assume then you're saying that you know what the effects are at the moment, but I have understood that before you're looking for more information to understand that kind of effects. So, which one is it? Because if you need baseline data, you don't, presumably don't know what the information is and the effects are. But then you're saying that the effects are okay at the moment. I don't understand which one it is. Or am I not understanding that correctly?
No, that's okay.
And we're talking effects here, as I understand it, on the, mainly the macro algae works for the increased forest of that as an adverse effect within the estuary environment. Is that the main, what is the main effect that you would be looking at?
Yeah, so it's one of the key concerns is that the contribution of nutrients from the wastewater treatment plant is resulting in regular nuisance algal blooms on the intertidal flats in the harbour. Based on the data we have, we know that it's happened once. Having said that, Richard, I think it's important to note that although the wastewater treatment plant is a contributor to the nutrients that would fuel that growth, it's not the only factor in the catchment that is contributing nutrients to the harbour. So yes, we know there's been one instance of nuisance macroalgae being reported in the harbour. From memory of that work that was done in 2021, it was the percentage of the intertidal flats that had that nuisance macroalgae on them was about, I probably shouldn't guess,
So
not guess, but
it doesn't need to be specific, so they are just sort of just giving a feel for, from an ecological point of view, and I think Mr. Cochrane's also indicated the main adverse effect that we're looking at is that nuisance macroalgae presence and increased growth of nutrients into the environment.
yes, so that's one of them. So that's the downstream
Okay, yeah.
potential adverse effect, which could then have impacts on shellfish, and other intertidal habitats, and seagrass. Shellfish obviously support both people and birds. Seagrass is important for fish that utilise harbour, particularly snapper. So again, not just for biodiversity, for sake, there's an obvious interrelationship between the sediment, the macroalgae, and other things that live in those environments. So those are the downstream potential impacts. Upstream in the area where the modelling has indicated potential increased nutrient pressure. You have the salt marsh habitat. So again, these different organisms that are living in that salt marsh and that utilise it as their, feeding grounds or as their habitat, hanging out in, but also just general ecosystem health. So the concern, well, the potential adverse effect up there is if the nutrient pressure is too high for too long, then what happens is that the nutrient cycling processes in the soil become such that not only will the animals not be able to sort of live in that soil, but also will affect plant growth. And I guess, absolute worst case scenario is everything could kind of die off and make nitrogen state. I mean, that's pretty catastrophic and it's really unlikely, but we don't want to get to a scenario where that is even close to being possible. And now I can't remember the question.
So it's useful because it actually sets out what the potential effects may be.
Yes.
Say they are. So then, what then in your review and assessment of this are the likely effects? And I guess that's the sort of question, and what I'm hearing is that you're not really able to determine, and correct me if I've got this wrong, not really able to determine that until you know what is going on now, so that you then know what's going on now and what increased, well, is it an increased load because with the improved treatment, will there be an increased load? But the modelling shows that there will be increasing load. Yeah. Well, the increased nutrients, concentration. The potential of adverse effects. Do you know what the actual adverse effects ecologically are likely to be? Both, and I suppose it's in the 4 years before the new plants commission and then after.
Yeah, so part of my reasoning for why I said that I think things aren't going to change substantially so that we see any adverse effects occurring is that, this plant has been operational since, how long it was like the 80s or something like that. So these habitats have been receiving nutrient influxes since that time, and probably in a fairly similar manner to how they're receiving nutrients now. Based on the data we have at the moment, we're not seeing any visible adverse impacts in those salt marsh habitats. And with the upgrade of the wastewater treatment plant, the concentrations of nitrogen, which is one of the key nutrients conserved, is supposed to decrease. And based on the calculations that Bruce did by the end of the term of consent, they're going to get to be similar to what they are now. So, and those really high and what appear to be alarming concentrations that have come out of the modelling in terms of those upstream areas are under very exceptional circumstances that won't happen very often. So I think that for the most part, that's why I don't think this is going to be any particularly substantial change. But the qualifier to that is we don't have like a really detailed information together on these state everything's 100% okay. And so we do still need that data to ensure that we're not reaching some kind of point that might be detrimental to overall ecosystem health.
And that's the table.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Still asking on that triggers. There's may have been some relevance through this conversation, but just looking at your commentary on the situated like you comment about plot of land where you consider and there should be one metric triggering response. There should be two or more metrics across two or more sites over 4 years. So I guess a comment that I want to do is the particular trend does have merit. I've got some concern that particularly trend over a 4-year period may enable those people who treat to continue for too long. Compared with the relative immediacy of a single metric being triggered would require investigation of some sort to determine the cause, which may then trigger a formal and effective management response. Just interested in your thoughts on those two different approaches.
So, I guess the key reason why I feel like two parameters are required rather than just one is some of those metrics that you're intending to monitor do respond extremely quickly to economic flashes in a changed nutrient life. So there could just be like there could be one single, not saying this necessarily a realistic scenario, but you could have one situation where you just get like a really big pulse of nutrients and you have to monitor, immediately after that, and so say chlorophyll goes through the roof because microalgae respond very quickly to changes in nutrients in the environment. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's chronic stress in that system that's going to cause that long-term degradation of the habitat. And so it's trying to balance that, the concern is valid, it's trying to balance that responsiveness to a potential, real issue with, I guess, how super responsive some of those metrics are. So I agree that, we're not necessarily there yet in terms of being able to clearly identify, where that threshold sits, and that's part of, based on monitoring information will show how, I guess, we call it kind of like it's noisy data. Ecology of data is often very noisy, because volatile systems just, fluctuate naturally. I'm not sure if I feel like I'm getting back to the question, but yeah, I feel like the multiple rounds of that monitoring are needed to be able to see what that looks like and then set an appropriate response threshold. That wouldn't be, either extreme of the data and therefore represents a more balanced approach to determining where that threshold should sit.
Yeah. I'll keep it one event one time,
yeah,
and try and find the cause versus two events over a 4-year period. I'm not an expert in this, mate, but it sounds quite a different way, quite a different raft of triggers to then require a response. So I'm just unfortunate either we should refer. So, and a wastewater treatment plant, for example, it was table 4 there, it was considered something cold. And so that was one of them, and the consent holder gave notice of it. He investigated whether it was just a blood, like that, blood appeal, I think you were referring to, or whether it's something that required intervention. So I'm trying to reconcile the two different views, one trigger, one time versus 2 triggers over a 4-year trend, and how it works. I'd just be interested in where the land is to know where the land is most optimal place. So I know this best out of getting evidence.
No, that's right.
Thank you.
Yeah, just thank you. Just picking up on your wetland site visit, and you recommended there should be further investigation. In relation to your wetland site visit, and you recommended, you said there was probably a need for further investigation because, as you say, it wasn't picked up in the first round of monitoring done. And I just wondering when that might happen, because I can't see it anywhere in the EMP or in a condition that has to be undertaken, because I thought that would now form part of the baseline, because it's now an area that's been identified as being affected.
Yes, so I'm not sure what, my computer again, I'm not sure what version of the EMP you have and the proposed monitoring. Oh, okay.
We've got hopefully we've got the most recent. That would be a little bit concerning if we did. Yeah, I mean, the reason I picked up on it is partly because you said further investigation, but you also said this is in your supplementary evidence at 4.13D, you said that you thought the effects could be moderate compared to the current situation, and acknowledging that the modelling was the worst case scenario, so it's based on the modelling. And you say, without existing baseline, the risk of reaching an ecological threshold tipping point cannot be conclusively stated at this time. And so that's where I was coming from, I guess, is that you obviously had some concerns. Well, I read into that, so it seems to me like that was something that actually did need to be done because it's part of the baseline.
Yeah, so
do you agree with that?
One of the locations that I visited, if you on the PowerPoint that was sent to you with the figures, yeah. So if you go to the MMP statistics, page 24 of the PowerPoint. So when we had revised the EMP monitoring, potential monitoring locations as a result of Mr. Clifford's hydrodynamic modelling, and it indicated that those areas upstream of the bridge were potentially getting more nutrients. I had, as a nominal potential location, I had to put in the location 5, which is in kind of, not a square shaped, but kind of a square-ish shaped area on the true left side of the Matarangi stream. When I went to that site in November, you can see to the south of there's a whole lot of bare ground in the neighbouring property. That's an unconsented and informal landowner tip, basically.
Yeah.
And so, although within the areas I traversed, not exactly where dot number 5 is, but in that section of salt marsh, I saw some areas that gave me pause, like it was like, okay, there's something
Yeah,
potentially going on here.
yeah,
The amount of, the variability of stuff that I saw in Active and particularly not knowing at all what is in there. Just like, well, some of what I can see here might be the result of whatever he's got in his landfill. So when I said further investigations, it was kind of like, well, is that place the best place for us to necessarily put a monitoring location? And, or is it going to make it too difficult for us to be able to separate out what's happening there? So that was more where I was thinking.
okay.
Yes.
But I guess, but it still points to, I mean, you have said there could be moderate effects. So there's still a question about, you know, if there are moderate effects, what does that actually mean? And because you don't have any information about it, I guess what I'm asking is, so what's the solution? You know, are you now saying you don't need to do further investigation, or it's just too difficult? Or both?
Or it appears to be compromised.
Yeah, I think I saved further down somewhere, I can't remember if it was in my evidence or in the EMP, but I think I said something that we need to revise the locations of the monitoring. So I mean, I wanted to put a site there because the modelling did indicate that it's probably one of the first places where the you know, so it's one of the first places closest to the discharge drain, but beyond the bridge, where those potential nutrient loads could, you know, build up over the years. So I was quite keen to put something in there.
Yeah.
But I now just wonder whether that's, like you say, a location for monitoring and something else needs to be. Well, is sorry.
Just on that next one about the potential for moving monitoring sites, I was just interested in what your thoughts about what the implications are for trend detection. Because if you're starting at one point, and then you know, I mean, the EMP relies to some extent on detecting trends, but if you change your monitoring sites, that's going to be a bit of an issue, isn't it? In terms of detecting trends, or what, what do you think?
We would. I would say that, you know, if I decided that location was compromised, I just wouldn't put one there at all, just put it somewhere else.
Yeah, no, I was talking more generally about, you made a comment about potentially moving monitoring sites.
Oh, right.
Not just more generally, not just that site.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. So there was a response to one of regional council's questions about mangrove expansion into some of the salt marsh habitat. And initially I just thought, well, so I know I've been to regional council, for example, I'm not sure about how Wastewater does it, but when they established their extra monitoring program, they had like a range of different points that they were to consider, and the actual site selection of where you end up doing it. I might not be making sense. So initially when I thought about that, I thought, you know, if there comes a point where one of our salt marsh sites gets completely invaded by mangrove, but I don't know if or not, then you could conceivably move it. But since I wrote that, I guess I thought about it some more and agreed that it probably would decrease usability of that data. So
and I don't think
I have an answer for how to not protect against, but to approach that if it did become a problem.
Yeah, I do appreciate it. It is a reality, and I know that there are also other places where things change in the symmetry, and maybe you have to sediment build up. But you kind of answered my question. It does decrease the usability of the data, so that is a risk. And so I guess the next question is there a way of sort of future-proofing that in some way?
I think probably the best way to future-proof is to increase the number of monitoring sites.
Exactly. Chair. Oh yeah, and I guess we've kind of traversed this quite a lot, this idea of that, on the fact that the thresholds may change over time, and well, that's my understanding, that as you refine them, I guess, and therefore, can the panel have confidence that what's being proposed now and any refinements are going to be robust enough to continue to check potential effects and therefore trigger the whole EMP process?
I think that following, that full baseline data set collection will provide sufficient information for us to be able to set thresholds that are appropriate both now and into the future.
So when you say the baseline, do you mean the 4 years or the 8 years? Because 8 years is a long time. It's a long time before you are confident you have something that is what you think is useful.
I
don't want to put you on the spot.
What's that?
I don't want to put you
No,
on the spot.
that's okay. I think in terms of number of data points, 8 years are obviously better because it's more data. But this probably isn't going to be that helpful, but it'll probably depend on what that first 4 years of data looks like. If, like you indicated before, as a hypothetical scenario, you're getting something bouncing a lot, then that's concerning is not the word, but it makes it more challenging to set that. But I'm not a statistician, but I expect there's stats-based methods that can be used to set a more appropriate threshold based on the history of the data that we have across all monitoring sites. And I guess
I think under 6.2 of your ecological monitoring, you've got your 30 proposed 8-year monitoring period.
I think there's a few things around that we discussed a little bit over lunch, and I think we're going to have quite a targeted chat about that after the close today. And so,
Tightening things up.
yeah, we may be able to respond to that a bit later.
Thank you. Let's go ahead.
Quite sure why.
Neither am I. I just got told.
Maybe some of the
Yeah.
It's, unfortunately, we're going to have to call it quits for today, but we'll leave it open with Ms. McIntosh. I'm not sure that there's too much more that we have questions for you, but that's okay. We'll in the morning come back to you and then I think we're going okay, and the submitters are aware that that time slots tomorrow. Okay. Thank you very much for your presence today and the lesson perfect acoustics, but we'll follow that tomorrow. Thank you very much, everyone. Yes, 9. Yeah, across the way.